right, welcome back to another episode of Vancouver Real. My name is Andy Zaremba, and with me, back behind the mic again, is Mike.
That's right. We're calling this the Sty Cam. I'm really grateful that most of our audience is audio on iTunes because I have a massive sty in my eye and it's not beautiful. So I might keep the camera a little bit away from my face today and keep it on the two handsome burly men in front of me. So
we are burly.
Nice to see you all. Welcome back. Welcome to the new year. First podcast of the new year being recorded for us. Mm-hmm. And as per usual, we're podcasting here at a float house at 70 West Cordova Street in downtown Vancouver, BC. Floathouse.com is our website. So check it out if you are visiting Vancouver or you live in Vancouver. And if you haven't floated in a while, if you haven't floated, period, come down and check it out. It's an amazing practice for stress management, for meditation, for visualization, for chronic pain, for insomnia, for chronic fatigue syndrome. You name it, the float tank can do it.
Well, you know, that's one of the red flags. Sometimes we'll have experts break down the float tank, and they'll be like, as soon as somebody says it can cure everything, they have a few red flags about that.
I saw that.
However, in terms of generating a parasympathetic nervous system response, it does that very reliably and well, which is great and has a lot of benefits associated with that.
But actually, everything I did say too, it actually does.
It's
help.
True. Yeah.
So I didn't
just sounds
say
like a lot
cancer
of
or
things.
anything. So.
That's all.
Yeah.
We could have told us a cooler story about your eye, though. I could have been like, we had a fight.
Or we could have said
that.
I got bit by a snake down in Peru, and
that would have been neat. Or a spider.
But that's not what happened. I just woke up one morning and it was sore, and it got bigger and bigger, and now it's big.
This is where you are.
And uncomfortable.
You just have to accept that.
Yeah, it's true. Like, it's amazing how much it irritates the eyeball and how distracting it is. Yeah. But so if you have a sty, I completely empathize and sympathize with you because it's not great. But
it's gross. Let's stop focusing on your sty.
All right.
Enough sty talk for now.
Back to you.
Back to me. So also we have a bunch of things going on at Vancouver Real. We are doing our monthly meetups. And big thanks to Candace White for coordinating and organizing all of those meetups. The next one we have coming up is this weekend, January 14th, which unfortunately you won't be able to go to because you won't be listening. This is too soon before that workshop begins. But we have a workshop every month. And the next one coming up is most likely going to be at Juice Truck. And it's going to be a nutrition juice truck hosted by Zach, which should be pretty cool. And we got a really cool thing coming down the pipe, which I'm not going to say quite yet. But it will be really exciting when I get to announce that. So just, there's really cool stuff coming. So be ready for that cool stuff.
And we have a group page for that, right?
We have a group page, yeah. So if you want to get involved with the community, find the Vancouver Real Meetups group page. And we'll accept you as a member, and you can get notified for all of our meetups and social events and get linked into the community.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And last but not least, we send a shout out to our friend who helps us behind the scenes here at Vancouver Real, Omid Pakbin from Omega Point YouTube channel, and he's also on Facebook. He's a very talented videographer and video editor and musician actually as well. And he's got a really cool YouTube channel that we always want to promote because he helps us here produce Vancouver Real, and we're very grateful to have him. And finally, I want to but just acknowledge the unceded Coast Salish lands that this city inhabits and is recognizing this territory basically of the First Nations people that live here. And we try to do that as much as we can on this podcast because it's important. It's important to recognize this land and perhaps some of its past and how it hasn't been a super harmonious past. And I think it's appropriate to acknowledge it at the very least and to do so on the air. So in preparation for today's episode, I could have gone and done research online and studied everything I could find about you on the internet. However, I decided to be very yogic with it and just do a yoga class. And so that's what I did. I'm like, I'll live and breathe what we do.
Well, I'm excited for our guest today personally, because this has been a long time coming, right? Has it not?
It sure has.
Yeah.
My mic's live now.
Oh, you've been live the whole time.
Oh, I had so many things I wanted to talk about the sty.
Oh, well, you could just jump.
Maybe
in
we
there.
can get into it later.
We'll get into it later.
If we run out of things to
Near
talk
the end of the
about, we'll
podcast.
bring it back to the sty.
Yeah. So Kent Brun, I actually did your podcast, the Kent Brun Podcast, like a year and a half ago, maybe. I don't remember when it was. And it was really awesome. Kent interviewed myself on his podcast, and we talked a little about floating and just like life and philosophy. It's a really interesting and fun podcast. And Kent's also a co-lead at Karma Yoga Teachers 200-hour teachers training and a Lululemon ambassador. And as I recall, you were a bobsledder at one point too, right?
Yeah, I come from a sporting background.
Amazing. Were you like involved in the Olympic team at all?
No, I never competed at the Olympics.
Right.
I got pretty close.
Yeah.
I would say I was on the bubble, but I never actually competed in the Olympics.
Right. And you're a big man, and there's not a lot of yogis out there that have your kind of build. And you actually played football as well, right?
Yeah, I played football in university.
That's awesome. I feel like I found a counterpart to myself a little bit, because we're ex-football players as well, and not a lot of football players start going the yogic life afterwards. I know a couple that have, but not a lot. And one question I think about often is like, why does somebody go down the path in life that they do? You know what I mean? Like, you're this football player, athlete, and you've chosen almost not an opposite path, but a different path than staying on that path that you could have stayed on, and maybe staying involved with football and coaching or being involved with that world, right?
Absolutely.
So what was it for you that kind of shifted what you do and, the whole kind of direction of your life?
Well, I think that probably, to be honest, my life path started before sports in a direction that was probably a lot more congruent with yoga than football or bobsled. And from a very early age, I was always fascinated in superheroes, like comic books and the Batman the Animated Series. I remember the debut episode when I was probably about 7, 8 years old. I remember my mom sitting me down, and it was prime time on Fox. And I watched an episode of Batman the Animated Series. And superheroes always in general spoke to me. And then I actually got into professional wrestling.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, as a teenager. And as a kid, I was not allowed to watch professional wrestling. My parents thought it was silly.
Yeah.
And this is the same story that most of the yoga teachers, I'm sure, have told you of how they got into yoga, right? It's all of the normal paths or steps along the path are probably coming up for the other teachers you talk to.
But wrestling, football, bobsled,
it was professional wrestling, and I always wanted to be a professional wrestler because that to me seemed very close to being a superhero. I feel like I kind of, from superheroes and comic books, got into professional wrestling because it was larger than life and it was athleticism. And then I noticed that a lot of professional wrestlers had started out with football careers. So I thought that somehow in my head that was probably, if I wanted to become a professional wrestler, if I started playing football in high school, then that might be one path to get the athleticism or the attributes necessary to be a professional wrestler.
Interesting, because I know that's true. Like The Rock, perfect prime example right there.
Yeah,
he was at, I think, Miami, and then he was in CFL for a little bit. And there's a video about him online that went around a little while ago about him telling a story about how his dad's like, "You're throwing away your career, son. You're throwing away your football career." And then he decided to go into professional wrestling, but his dad supported him in the end, and it turned out really happy and trained him, and he became this superstar. Right?
Yeah. No, I think that there's a lot of football players that have become professional wrestlers, but I think for me what it was is this idea of how do you become a superhero? And that's something that's still consistent with what got me into yoga, was this idea of what always attracted me about Batman, or place any superhero in the story that you want. What always attracted to me about these characters was not so much the going out in the middle of the night and solving crimes or punching people in the face. What always attracted me was how did they become a superhero? How did they get their superpowers? That traveling to the Himalayas, right? To the Himalayas. Doctor Strange, exactly. A perfect example of that, right? Going to study with the Ancient One and learn new ninjutsu and learn how to meditate. But when I was a kid, it wasn't really something that was as accessible as it is now in our culture. Like, I didn't know of any yoga studios back in the early 90s when I was really into Batman, the animated series. Yeah. And if somebody had sat me down and said, this is how you meditate, I probably would have really been into it. But just the way life unfolds, I think it was sports that provided probably the closest path to becoming Batman as I could see.
Sure. Well, I mean, you get to kind of act heroic sometimes, and there are moments of heroism on the field. There's the physicality of it, the building yourself up, the skill development, and then you become like a really good, football player or person at your sport, right? Mm-hmm. And I could totally see, actually, a lot of yoga teachers are ex-athletes, though.
Yeah.
And they probably get into it for various reasons. Personally, I got into yoga while I was doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And I'm like, I need to be more flexible. Sure. So I should go do yoga to get more flexible. And then over time, the jiu-jitsu started dropping off and the yoga stayed because I'm like, wow, the jiu-jitsu is destroying my body and the yoga is healing my body.
Interesting.
So it's interesting how it does draw in a lot of athletes and then kind of converts them over, and then they don't really go back a lot of the time.
Well, I think that, so for my podcast, it's Kent Brun Podcast, Professionals Talking Yoga, to put the plug in there. But essentially, it's not just yoga teachers. I have people like yourself that come on that are entrepreneurs that are doing something parallel or similar to the yoga practice, like Float House.
Yeah.
And I think, so I was going to chime in there, and people might be asking, like, why, like, we've had now, I think you're maybe the third like formal yoga teacher we've had on. And, we've actually tried to have others as well. And people might be like, well, why do we keep having yoga teachers on the podcast? And partially is because, Andy and I have both been practicing yoga for a very, 5, 6, 7 years now.
Since 2009, roughly.
Yeah, exactly. So, almost 10 years really. And obviously I've experienced the benefits of a regular practice, and it does cross-correlate to what we do here at Float House. It's kind of like you were saying why Andy was on your podcast, even though he's not a yoga teacher. And so for us, it's communicating a similar message and of presence, of mindfulness, of meditation, of just a different relationship with reality, really, that these practices can teach you. And so I just wanted to throw that in there as to why we do have these yoga teachers constantly on. And but bringing it back to you, I remember at Y Yoga in North Shore, that's where I first met you back when, probably like 2010-ish. Sure. And was that when you were first starting to get into yoga?
No, I had gotten into yoga previously, and probably about 2006 was when I took my first class. I had taken a class many years before that at the local rec center, and the girl that I was dating at the time, we went to probably what would be a gentle hatha type class, and we kind of formed our relationship in that we both like to go to the gym a lot. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was, this is sort of that Batman sitting in the meditation that I've been looking for my whole life. Mm. But for her, she was the person who I've taught now several times throughout my yoga career, in as far as the person in the back of the room that's doing the push-ups when you're teaching meditation. So I remember being a little bit embarrassed as probably about a 15-year-old kid, where she started just throwing her own squats and push-ups and everything else in the middle of the yoga poses. Right. But 2006 is when I started practicing yoga. 2010, after not going to the Winter Olympics, I got injured. I herniated some discs in my back, and I got a burn in my shoulder in a bobsled crash. And I actually broke my arm too after.
Ouch.
With the all in bobsled crashes.
Wow.
Just sort of one after another, after not experiencing a lot of pain in sports generally for a whole life.
Yeah.
But I didn't go to the Olympics. I'm not sure necessarily if I would have gone to the Olympics if I had stayed healthy, but I was on the bubble. Anyways, being a carded athlete, so when the government pays you a very modest amount of money to be at a certain level as an athlete. Sometimes community partners will throw in perks to those athletes, and Y Yoga threw in a free yoga pass. So I started going very regularly to yoga after I got injured in 2010. And it was actually that sort of pulled me away from whatever it was that was out of balance in my personality. And I'm not a completely centered or balanced person, even though, and you don't have to be to still teach yoga. We're all practicing. But whatever I had in my personality that was allowing me to be so competitive that I could spend 8 hours a day training to push a sled down a refrigerated ice rink, essentially, right? Roller coaster. Whatever that was out of whack for me, it just started to kind of melt away when I practiced yoga. But one of the conversations that's consistent in the podcast that I do is so many teachers, people that fall into the path of yoga, we do come from an athletic background or a dance background or something similar to that where there's movement involved. Not always, but for a lot of the people I talk to. And so often we have a common story, which is at the age of 24, 25, or whenever it is, when you stop your athletic career, your dance career, maybe because of injury or whatever else you stop doing and you get into yoga, there's a bit of a quarter life crisis. It's an interesting thing because it hits earlier for athletes. It hits earlier for dancers than it does for people that after high school get into a job and they have that steady gig until they're 50 and then the midlife crisis hits. But when you identify yourself so much as a dancer, or I would identify myself so much as an athlete, it didn't matter when I went from playing football in university to being a bobsled athlete because I still had that identity.
Yeah.
But when that disappeared on me, what I used yoga for at first is it was a Band-Aid, and I became very much a yogi. And I say that term with complete compassion because as a yogi, in quotations, I realize in hindsight that what I was doing was I was still identifying as something that was very superficial and not actually who I am, right?
Right. I can completely understand that path, especially when you're really dedicated to a sport at a high level, relatively high level, playing university ball. It's spending a lot of time. That's a huge part of your identity. For a long time in my life, I was Andy, the football player. That's who I was, right? And then similarly, I started doing martial arts, and I was like, okay, I can make that transition pretty easily. I have that athletic component. There's a competitive component towards it. It's still kind of macho and manly and cool to be doing something like that. And then when that all starts fading away, it's interesting that you talk about, like, who are you after that all goes away? And yeah, for a while there, you start falling into the path of, or you talked about falling in the path of being a yogi and saying, okay, now I'm a yogi. And now you've changed your identity again. But even, like you said, that's superficial. So what is it, do you think, about yoga that helped you move past that superficial labeling of what you do or who you are? What element of it, why does that do that for so many people in general?
Well, for me, I can speak to my own personal experience. But for me, it's this understanding of the philosophy in yoga, and people can disagree. Intelligent people can disagree, of course. But for me, yoga is the realization, and there's many definitions that I use, but the realization that you're no one special. I am no one special. And what a relief that actually is, because in our society, we're built into such a momentum of you are incredibly special. And that is overwhelming to hear from your parents, from your teachers, from your coaches, that you're special. And the yogic philosophy, when you realize that you're in fact no one special, and that in fact we are all just the same thing in different bodies right now in this context. We're all the universe. We're all one. That's the yogic philosophy.
Yeah.
And that in itself is incredibly special, but you are no one special. because there is no you.
So it starts stripping away your ego in your sense of self-importance and how big, your problems are or aren't in your life, right?
And I can understand that at least in a theoretical term. Now, putting that into practice on a daily basis is very challenging because it's so easy to create separation between you and the person that cut you off in traffic. You're minding your own business, you're living your life to your fullest, and there's some asshole that cut you off in traffic, right?
How dare they?
But if you follow the yogic philosophy, no, you're all the same thing. They're not cutting you off in traffic. It's all one.
Right.
So what do you, when that happens in terms of yogic philosophy and the yogic practice, now this is kind of yogic beyond the mat, let's say, what do you try to do? Like, so if you're enraged because this person cut you off or you're upset, you're triggered, what's the yogic way to not be triggered or to rectify that in the moment or whatever?
Well, I think for me, more than an actual system or taking a step back and breathing or whatever you would hear, typically the advice for people that have anger issues would be, for me, what I'm noticing is just the simple fact that I'm noticing. I might catch myself when I get caught off guard and get caught into the almost psychosis of I'm different from that person. I still get angry. It still happens all the time. But I think more and more and more as I move through this path of yoga, it happens in such a way where at least I'm able to acknowledge the truth of the situation, the truth that we are one. And it sounds so much like we hear this terminology of we are one and we're the universe doing exquisite things that it becomes like wallpaper, but it really is this beautiful remembrance. Yoga to me is also the process of constantly remembering that we are one when we forget that we are one. Yeah. So I think that just for more and more often, I remember the reality or the truth.
I'm reading this book right now. It's called Meeting the Shadow. And it's a kind of a compilation between a lot of different like psychologists and theory and all sorts of stuff. And in that book, they're talking about how, the book itself is mostly about the shadow ego, and that's the part of the ego that we suppress because it's actually, for whatever reason, not kosher to express some of the thoughts that we might be having.
Right.
And this one part of the book was talking about how. So that's like so distracting.
Sorry,
this is my train of thought. I know it's okay.
Go back to the book.
Back to the book. Yes. So, goddamn.
You're one.
What was the book was about the theories, and you're talking about the shadow ego.
Right, the shadow ego, and they're talking about how if you have like wounds that are built deep into you and you build up defensive mechanisms to protect yourself from those wounds, and that's part of your shadow ego, which you suppress because it might be something that's pretty unsavory, that you can't really reach that state of enlightenment until you actually go through and address all of those wounds. Like you have to, or else they will keep coming up, and they will keep coming up over and over and over. There's a little term I've heard thrown around a bit lately is like the spiritual bypass, where it's just like, there's stuff coming up inside you, but you're just like, oh, no, everything's fine. Nothing's bothering me, but you still have these issues that repeatedly come up over and over and over. And I've heard unless you actually go into those specific wounds, whatever that is that's causing those issues, that they're going to keep coming up regardless, And I think that's the one thing that I think, it's easy for me anyways. Sometimes I'll be like, oh yeah, let's be really present. I'll start breathing, get into my body. But it's like if I don't, but if there's like a repeated pattern of behavior that keeps coming up, or I respond a certain way to certain situations, that's a pretty big indicator that I need to address something that's going on there. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And I think it's just, I think it's a fine balance between like not just bypassing it all and being like, okay, I'm super present and that stuff doesn't matter. Because if it keeps recurring for you, then it's like, you haven't really risen above that, you know? I think the actual line he said was something like, you can't reach enlightenment until you've like dealt with all of those underlying issues, you know?
Well, there's certain sects of Buddhism that say that nobody gets to actually move on and transcend until we're all enlightened. So you can't just do all of your work and then leave everybody behind. And I think that it's one of the issues of what people talk about with spiritual bypassing is this idea of just not dealing with what's actually pertinent, right? Like almost, well, if we just ignore that and move on, it'll be fine. Do they give steps for how to deal with traumas?
No, and I'm definitely not a therapist or anything like that. So this is just the book explaining this element. But like, one of the things that they tell you to look at is if you have a strong emotional response to something, especially if it's a strong negative emotional response, that could be an indicator that's something you need to look into, especially if it comes up repeatedly for you. And like dig deep into that, and why does that situation draw that response out of you for whatever reason, right? And it's just something that could be ingrained in us since childhood for whatever reason, right?
So it's pretty much like looking when something's irritating you or frustrating or triggering you, it's just being honest with that fact. Like, I am triggered right now, and trying to, just be real with that, instead of, like you said, trying to ignore it or justify why you feel that way. It's like, how do I be with that? Are you guys looking at my sty?
No.
Oh, okay. I'm a little self-conscious.
Well, they say that the left eye, which is where the sty is the emotional eye or the truthful eye. And that the right eye is the eye that you can project out into the world. So if somebody is really sad, but they're putting on a happy face, the right eye might be huge, but the left eye will be sort of half open.
Interesting.
So what's going on with you right now, Mike, that created this sty?
That's a good question. That's actually what Adam said too. He's like, what are you not trying to see?
Yeah.
And like, I had thought about that. So, I don't know, to be honest with you. I think there's definitely stuff. I just got back from Peru doing some pretty intensive introspective work with the plant medicines of ayahuasca and wachuma. And, the integration back into North American lifestyle and westernized culture and colonialism of what we have here is, it's easy to kind of jump back in, but when you've done a lot of churning on the inside, things could pop up. So, I had a really sore throat, this cough, which I think everybody has, but now this sty. So, I'm just trying to be aware and doing my meditation and then trying to be aware when we have conversations and like, if I get triggered by something, like, okay, well, what's happening, and be honest about that. So,
what's interesting, this silly cam thing going on right now. If I were truly an enlightened being, I'd be just like talking very calmly, and the cam thing would fall over, and I wouldn't be distracted. I'd be like, doesn't matter. But I'm like, there's part of me in my peripheral be like, oh, something's wrong. I got to address that problem over there. It's distracting me from this being present in this conversation. And that's literally what happened. It took my train of thought away from what I was trying to do because something else was drawing my attention. It's like a little test from the universe saying,
this camera is your guru.
Yeah, in a sense, right? It's like, that's a little example of like something that's external to me that was affecting me from being present in what I was doing.
Yeah.
Right.
And it happens all the time. There's always something that's going to pull you out of whatever you're actually doing, right? So with your teacher training, do you have these sorts of discussions with the teachers, or is it more about, teaching safe yoga, posturally, all that kind of stuff?
So
how does it go?
I'm the co-lead of the 200-hour training at Karma Teachers. And what I generally am doing for the most part is the work with students of how do we safely align our students? How do we safely align our bodies? So I do a lot of alignment work, a lot of sequencing work, a lot of holding space as a teacher. The philosophy, Emerson Lim, who's the founder of Karma Teachers, he spends a few hours with them every day going over philosophy, pretty much in line with one of his teachers. Well, he's got several teachers, but one of his teachers is Paul Ferrini. So he follows the work of Paul Ferrini. And they do a lot of work with the shadow self and with healing and acknowledging traumas. I think that when you do the yoga postures, it's interesting because Andy brought it up, but this idea of spiritual bypass. And oftentimes you can go to a push-up class at the local yoga studio.
Yeah.
And you can get your green juice and you can walk out of there and then you can start yelling at your whoever, right? And I know that for me, that was a big realization for my practice, is if my yoga practice is actually not creating more peace or serenity for me, then what is it? What is the purpose of this?
Well, other than the fact that it's good for your body and you're maintaining mobility and all that good stuff.
Sure.
The other place I take it to is my wanting and desiring for like things, possessions, achievements, that sort of thing as well. Like I'm making a practice now as much as I can to like consume and not use and be as much of a minimalist as possible. Like how little do I actually need to get by on a day-to-day basis? And it's crazy, like by doing that, like I've stopped eating out. Like I make all my own food, pack all my own food every day. You know, I one of my little goals every day is to not spend money, which is kind of weird, but that's what I'm trying to do. And it's amazing by doing that, not eating out, not buying unnecessary things. I've been able to save quite a bit of money just because I'm like living like that. And it's like my life is still very fulfilled and satisfying. And like I feel like I have everything that I need and my days are packed, you know, but yet I'm not consuming crazy. You know, I feel like that's another extension of where it can go as opposed to just like, how am I behaving? Well, I guess that is a behavior in a way, your consuming habits, right?
Yeah. Well, I think for me, when I look at the yoga philosophy, one of the teachings that I come or take with me is that we're living life at a 10. Like everybody is perfect. And the yogic philosophy tells us that everybody has always been perfect. We've always been at a 10. But there's a lot of illusion they refer to in the yogic philosophy. There's a lot of self-defeating ideology. There's a lot of momentum in our society that is telling us to go out and consume and to buy. But to live life at a 10, you don't actually need to go out and buy the latest of whatever it is that you think you need to go out and buy, right? That's not where happiness comes from.
And it's such a trap too that so many people get caught into, right? You get that new shiny phone or a new car, whatever it happens to be, feels good for a while, but then as always, after a few months, doesn't mean anything to you. After a year, you don't even like it anymore. Yeah. Right. So it's like everything that we buy is external to us. And I think that's such a important one to recognize, because I feel like just the state of like mass consumption has really gotten us to where we are as a society today with like, you know, looking at all the environmental destruction that's been caused by all of that, right?
Sure.
And a lot of it could be simply because of the excess, the consumption, that need to look for happiness externally to us. So we're always looking for the next thing, the next job promotion, the next raise, there's always something external to us that's going to complete us. When, like you just kind of addressed, we're already actually born complete. That's the cool thing.
Yeah. No, there's a feeling that we need to go out and get more and that we're not enough as we are. But the truth is just, and I think one of the great things about the yogic practice is that we start to shed things. I said earlier that there's many definitions of yoga, and I reserve the right to change my definition of yoga as I see fit. But for me, what I see yoga as recently is shedding, is like taking away that clutter, all of those things that are preventing me from seeing not only myself as a 10, but also to see that person that cut me off in traffic as they're a 10 too, they're perfect, right? But it's so easy, and we get caught up in these ideas of, well, to build something up, we have to put something down. So we other people from ourselves, and that makes the ego feel really good, because the ego, that separation between you and I, it starts to build a little bit more structure as I say that you're not as good as me, or that guy that cut me off is an asshole. But truth is, that's all illusion. It's all been perfect. Yeah. And so the yogic philosophy for me is starting to just get rid of the clutter, get rid of the mess. And I saw it initially when I started practicing yoga. Yoga for me was all about acquiring things physically, the physical postures. I talk about when I got into yoga or when I was a child and I really liked Batman, I wanted to use yoga to get to that. Right? I wanted to study in the Himalayas, like study in the mountains, meditate, learn ninjutsu, learn all these things so I could be Batman. I wanted to keep taking. When I started practicing the yoga asana, the yoga postures, I wanted to get the deeper variations of the poses. I wanted to get the handstands. And then once I could stand on my hands, then I wanted to be able to do it in lotus position. Then I wanted to be able to press up to it. When I got some of those things, I realized that none of them were making me happy. None of them were making me less angry. None of them were making me or allowing me to see my perfection.
And I feel like that's such an awesome tool for yoga too, because you know, you could look at it this way, like in a sense that there's always going to be somebody more advanced than you, right? So it's like, oh, I'll be a good yogi when I can do that, you know? Or you feel some short-term sense of accomplishment when you've reached that pose. But guess what? You can probably take that pose further in some way, right? Yeah. And it never really ends. You can always take it a little bit further. So you start realizing that's another teacher of like, yeah, you can chase that pose forever. But it's, you know, when are you going to be satisfied with what you're doing, right? And this kind of brings me into the subject of, or the idea around acceptance, right? So also in like spiritual philosophy, there's the idea of acceptance and like accepting what is and being okay with what is. But I feel like there's a fine line. It's like, because we do live in a physical reality that requires us to take action from time to time, it's like, yes, you can sit there under a tree and be a monk, and you could do that if you wanted to. But sometimes there might be a time for you to take a stand on something, and you need to put your foot down and say no more, or I'm going to change something or take some kind of an action. So, you know, how do you make that distinction between I'm going to accept what is as opposed to I'm going to take action and make a change in my life if I can?
One of the great scriptures, one of the great books that you can read as far as yogic philosophy goes is the Bhagavad Gita. And it's a section of the Mahabharata. But the Bhagavad Gita is a little bit controversial for some people in yoga because if you read it through a certain lens, you can see it as being talking about war, battle, or murder as being a positive thing. So essentially, to give a real brief of the synopsis of the Bhagavad Gita, is our protagonist is Arjuna, and Arjuna is this great archer. And he comes from the lineage of kings. Like he comes from, his father is the king of the kingdom. And the cousins, his family, his cousins, they throw a military coup to take power. So that's when the Bhagavad Gita starts. You understand the situation, and then they say, basically a stranger came to town, and the stranger said, I will give one of these sides in the battle, I will offer my army. To the other side, I will offer my counsel. So the greedy cousins, of course, go, we're going to take the army. So Arjuna is left with the stranger as counsel. And the Bhagavad Gita is a conversation between Arjuna and who reveals himself eventually to be Krishna, the avatar, like the embodiment of God. So good counsel, it turns out, in the end. But Arjuna is not sure that he wants to go to battle, even though he knows he's entitled to the kingdom, even though that he knows that his family are benevolent rulers and they want what's good for the kingdom. It's very clear in that they're the good guys and the cousins are the bad guys. Like, that's not up for debate. But he still thinks, well, maybe I should just put my bow down. Maybe I should just surrender to this, and then nobody has to die. But what happens in the chariot when they're having this conversation, because before he makes this decision, he asks Krishna, as a chariot driver, just drive me up. I want to see the eyes of the army that I'm about to potentially go fight. I might surrender because I don't want to kill my cousins. I don't want to kill my brethren. I don't want to kill people I grew up with. So in this conversation, at the beginning of the conversation at least, Krishna tells Arjuna, listen, this is your dharma. This is your life path. You are a great archer. You're the best military tactician, and you have the best mind for this. Like, you're on this earth to be a soldier. So if you become a pacifist, if you lay your bow down now, people will die eventually. They might not die in this battle, but nobody's going to be happy because there's going to be this horrible tyrannic leadership that's going to come into place. You know that. You know that your cousins are not good people. So you have to stand up and you have to fight. And one of the lessons that is taught here is that karma is produced when we're not living our dharma. So if you're here to be a soldier, and this is why people have issues with this as a yogic text, because basically what it's saying is God is telling them that you have to go kill. Now, the caveat, like sort of the twist of the story is if you believe in reincarnation, then life and death isn't as sort of final as some of us in the West might consider it, right? So the idea is you can go and kill these people, Arjuna, and you're in the right, and maybe in the next lifetime, they'll figure out how to live their dharma without creating karma. Yeah,
that's a hell of an answer for that question. But
basically, what I would say the answer to that is if you're living your life as a 10, if you're living your life in your perfection, and you know in your heart there's something you have to stand up for, and you will protect people that you love, you will protect people in your city, in your country, people all over the world, and you can be that shield of justice, then you have to stand up and fight for whatever that is you believe in.
That's an interesting idea. That's a very interesting idea. Yeah, because I mean, that is like your path. Mm-hmm. And it's, I can't remember where I heard this one, but somebody was talking about, it's Eckhart Tolle, actually. He was talking about how, being present is actually a neutral state of being. There isn't excessive happiness necessarily. You're present, but there isn't excessive suffering. You might be in pain, but you might not be suffering. But he did talk about how when you start going into other states, say joy, or he used the word enthusiasm as being actually one of the highest states of being. Because I think the root word for enthusiasm is being with God or God energy or something like that.
Yeah, probably to be enthused, so to have God inside of you, I guess would probably be the etymology.
And he was saying that, if you find that enthusiasm and you feel it and you're doing that thing and you're getting great joy out of doing that thing, then you're probably on the path. You probably should be doing that thing. So it's so interesting, right? It's like, and I could see why so many people would have issue with that, because it really touches on morality and what's right and what's wrong. It's like, well, why should I go kill these people? But if you zoom out from a bigger perspective and you look at it as like a cosmic dance and we are all one, and this is so hard to digest, and I understand why it's so hard to digest, but there really is no right or wrong. It's just our minds labeling things as right or wrong.
Right. Well, so this idea of if it's your dharma and you have to pick up your bow and you have to shoot arrows at people and you have to cause violence, then that in theory is the opposite or antithetical to another great teaching of yoga that comes from more classical yoga texts, which is the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, there's the Ashtanga, the 8 limbs of the yoga practice. And when that's broken down to the yamas and the niyamas, one of the yamas is ahimsa, and ahimsa is non-harming or non-violence. So these texts in some ways can contradict one another. So if to be a yogi or to live the path of yoga means nonviolence, then how could it possibly be someone's dharma to be a soldier that would create violence? So I think that's why some teachers have decided, or some people not necessarily yoga teachers, but just anyone that would be interested in this sort of philosophy could find issue with it.
Sure. And going right on that path, though, you got to look at the nature of what might be happening. You know, like the morality. You know who does great talks about this kind of stuff is. Why did I draw a blank right now?
Sam Harris?
Sam Harris does amazing talks about morality and what's right, the difference between right and wrong, and crazy scenarios that you would never imagine. Be like, oh shit, well, yeah, what would I do in that situation? For example, like if you're that great soldier and you're supposed to go kill this army, and if you don't do that, that army is going to go kill a bunch of women and children in the village.
Yep.
So it's like by not taking action and causing that harm to those people are going to suffer. So then what's the right answer at that point?
Well, it's a root canal, right? Like as a dentist, you have to say, listen, this is going to suck right now, but it's going to be better for you if we take out that dead root now.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the thing. That's what Krishna is telling Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita. It's like, you have to go fight. They do have that sort of loophole or way out of, in our philosophy, don't worry, they come back and they've got more opportunities to figure this out, right? So if you don't subscribe to that, that automatically is like a huge red flag for people. But it is this idea of just, listen, you have to stand up, and to prevent more pain later, you have to go through a little bit of discomfort right now. And for some people, philosophically, it's why, like maybe if we just don't go through this little bit of discomfort, maybe another path will reveal itself that isn't that great pain.
Have you ever heard of this internet guy? His name is Bashar. Have you heard of Bashar?
No.
So Mike turned me on to Bashar. Now, I suggest if you're listening to this, go watch some Bashar videos on YouTube. Just go watch it and make your own decisions about what this guy's saying. But I watched this one video from him, and he basically said that you can't do it wrong. No matter how you're living your life, you can't do it wrong, and you're doing it exactly right all the time, no matter what you choose.
Right.
So I don't know how that resonates with people, but that's what he says. And this guy, so the Bashar character is this guy who is a channel, apparently, and he channels some kind of entity from somewhere, and the entity comes into him, and he speaks through this person who is a channel. You can say that's bullshit or not, I don't know. If you listen to him talk, he doesn't stumble or ever say the wrong thing ever, which is pretty impressive. But either way, if it is a guy just spitting a bunch of spiritual stuff out, like it's pretty bang on. And when he said that, I'm like, he's like, you can drop the pressure on yourself because you're doing it exactly right all the time anyways.
And that, I think that comes down to ultimately what's your personal belief and relationship with reality and what this whole thing is, existence and reality. And, a lot of spirituality and teachings will say that it is this infinite thing. And, we're here to learn, and that we do kind of have these reincarnation type experiences, whether you want to look into that like very verbally or not. People will actually say we're reincarnating all the time. Every moment to moment is a reincarnation. Like every moment it is like you're living and dying, death, life, like born, reborn. Like that's other perspectives of it. And, and it comes down to like just your general perspective of the whole thing. And, there's people have experiences on substances, and potentially maybe through Kundalini experiences too, where they experience, this sort of infinite loop, and they see it, and they have like some sort of visceral realization that is how it is. And, so it really depends on if someone's had that experience to be able to subscribe to it, or are they just believing it because it sounds like a pretty ideal situation. That's part of the problem with this stuff is like, do you subscribe to it because it's an ideal philosophy and you like the sounds of it and that makes you feel good? Or are you subscribing to it because you have a direct primary experience and you can believe it because you had that experience, and all you can have is your subjective experience of reality? And
that's why faith is such a slippery thing.
Mm-hmm.
Is because you don't know until you know. Anybody that says they know, they don't. Right. So faith is just believing in the things that you can't understand.
Right.
I really like your yogic stories, though. That's a really cool way. So there's so much value to that, because like
Right.
I asked a question and you told this great story that illustrated that exact dilemma that I was pointing out, which is it's such an interesting way of like a teaching coming across, you know?
Well, and again, here's a different definition for yoga, but yoga is just a lens that you can negotiate life with, right? So you learn these philosophies and you learn these stories, and every once in a while, there's something that just resonates or makes sense, and you can pull it out, right?
Yeah.
And I think that the approach of what you did with that story is the art of storytelling, and a lot of it's been an art for as long as humans been able to communicate, probably, and we don't. I mean, I guess our great movies kind of our storytelling. When you watch Star Wars and you see the archetypical forces that play, we get these lessons to us. The superhero movies are very much like that, right? Yeah. So we have that, but it's something really refreshing around the campfire, or around the podcasting table, where you have someone tell you a story that actually has like a lesson in it, and I don't know, I crave it. I enjoy it. I think it's such a cool art form that I would love to.
Well, and that to me is, we talk about like another thing that I grew up always loving is Star Wars. You said it. But I didn't realize that, okay, so when Luke is in Dagobah and he's being trained by Yoda, I didn't realize all the stuff that Yoda was saying would be this yogic philosophy that I get to actually study and teach now for a living. Mm-hmm. So that to me is really cool.
You see it pop up in a lot of movies for sure. Like The Matrix comes to mind. Like there's a lot of stuff in there. I'm sure you could rhyme off a couple other ones that have those. Avatar's got that in there. Who's talking about on the storytelling lines? Jordan Peterson. He's this guy at the University of Toronto, a psychology professor. And he's really big into this. He dives deep into the issue of political correctness, because he apparently at University of Toronto it's gone so crazy out of control that you can't say anything, and if you do, the ethics board's going to come and you could potentially lose your job over it. But he was talking about the Harry Potter series, and the reason it was so successful is because they had that storytelling element just right, all the archetypes just right to make the perfect story, and people just ate it up. So it's coming back to the idea of like storytelling and how you can how interesting that can be, like how you can learn from stories. Like, have you in your own
there's a formula to stories. I remember reading, my brother wanted to write screenplays. My older brother wanted to write screenplays, and I got his screenplay writing manual, and I started reading through it once when I was a little kid, because of course I wanted to do whatever my older brother did. Yeah. Right, Mike?
100%. Yeah. It's true. You do, man.
Yeah.
I kind of even followed you into the ravine all the time with my bike.
That's true.
That's how I got off of diapers.
Yeah.
True story.
Yeah, no, I believe it. But I remember just looking at this book and them breaking down how to write a screenplay. Like, these plot points need to be revealed at this specific moment. 10 minutes into your movie, they should know, like before you put your credits up, you should have a good idea of where the movie is going. Like all of these things that are actually, you can break them down and you can almost set a watch to how you write a screenplay and how you tell a story. And it's a formula.
It's interesting. It'd be interesting for myself to learn that, and especially with with our work, like telling the story around what we're doing here, basically, right? But have you dove a lot into like that kind of stuff, like the Bhagavad Gitas and some of the old spiritual texts from yoga? Have you done a lot of that kind of reading and learning?
You know where I get a lot of my information from? It's from podcasts. So there's Ram Dass Here and Now.
Oh, he has a podcast?
Well, he has a podcast that Mind, I want to throw out there correctly, but it's Mind Rolling or Mindcast, something like that. Duncan Trussell from Joe Rogan Experience does something with them, but
so it's a podcast that plays Ram Dass
lectures.
For the most part, it's old lectures. So stuff from the 70s, from the 80s, even stuff post-stroke, because about 16 years ago, somewhere in the early 2000s, Ram Dass had a stroke. So his speech now is quite labored, but they do have the occasional thing that's more recent, post-stroke. But he talks about the Bhagavad Gita and all this yogic philosophy. And that, to me, is somebody that I really align with. Ram Dass, hearing Ram Dass talk, that's where I get a lot of my information from.
Yeah.
But if
I'd
you go
check
to
that podcast out for sure.
if you go through my house, it's full of a lot of yogic books that I have not read.
They look
But
good
I
on your
have,
wall.
Very
I have
honest.
most of them.
Yeah. Well, they're good. You got them there just in case.
I try and dig through them.
Yeah.
Ram Dass has a great story on YouTube. If you want to hear this one, it's about how he basically, I guess, became enlightened. He was going to India. Maybe you've heard the story, and it's really amazing when he tells it. When he tells it, I get like goosebumps just from how he says it. He's talking about how he goes to India to meet Neem Karoli Baba, and when he meets him. On his way to meet him, he stopped the van one night, looked up at the stars, and started thinking about his mother who had just passed away. Next day, he goes to the guru. Everyone's kind of like kneeling and touching his feet and kind of kneeling down in front of him. And he's this Harvard professor who's like very proud, and he's not going to kneel at the feet of anybody. He's Harvard professor. Like, this is the elite of the elite, of the education system. And then Neem Karoli Baba sees him and like calls him over. He comes sits down, and the first words out of his mouth was something like, "Last night you were staring at the stars, thinking about your mother." And then at that exact moment, it hit him, and that was the thing that changed his entire life. And when you hear stories like that, apparently being around that guy, just being in his presence, you would like. There's another guy on that same video who talked about how you would just love everybody, which is insane. And I'd love to experience that at some point. If there's anybody in the world that can still do that, I don't know. But it's an interesting idea. The idea of it's almost that idea of going on a journey and finding that guru, and then he unlocks something in you, and then you're complete, right? I don't know. But
as silly as it sounds, the camera that keeps coming off of there, that is you getting to sit with Maharaji. That is you're getting to sit with your guru when that happens. So the idea is that it's always available to you. And for some people, like Richard Alpert, who becomes Ram Dass, through meeting his guru, he gets the name Ram Dass. Yeah. But, the idea is that's just that energy is put into a body for a brief time. And some people experience the guru as being in that body. But for other people, they can experience it in their own body through something like, why does that microphone or why does that camera keep falling off?
So true. And I believe that 100%. And I know that, but it's like, that's the unconscious part.
Well, and kind of like you said, it comes back to remembering.
Yeah.
Remembering that we all are one, or just remembering the practices and the philosophies and bringing that into your conscious life as much as possible. And that's challenging, but
even with Ram Dass, it's Love, Serve, Remember, and that's the name of his foundation, the Ram Dass Foundation, Love, Serve, Remember, right? So it's just love, serve, remember. That's really all there is to it.
Yeah.
The process of yoga is remembering that you're perfect and that everything's perfect. And when you're dealing with trauma, that's a really challenging lesson to continue moving forward with, that everything's perfect.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, and that's where they talk about how, I work with this one teacher named Phil Misterberger in Vancouver, and he talks about how he's like, sometimes your deepest pain can become your greatest gift to the world. And I totally believe that one, because it's like, if you have like that real pain point, whatever that happens to be, and we're all going to have pain points in our life. That's like a teacher screaming at you right there. And it's like, again, it's a way more extreme version of that camera falling off.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Ram Dass. Yeah. I actually listened to his book on Audible called Experiments in Truth, which is, I think, a compilation of all those lectures as well. And it's cool when you find a new, I don't know, something you gravitate towards, something that resonates with you. And I agree with you. He's one that connected with me when I started listening to it, introduced through Duncan Trussell's podcast. Actually, I'm like, he mentioned that audio book. I'm like, oh, I'm going to snag that. So I'm excited. Is there a lot of lectures of Ram Dass on that podcast then?
Yeah, they've got, I'm not familiar with the number, but I think it's probably up to about 50 lectures. They're all there for free.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, I get similar experiences when I listen to him, to Alan Watts as well, because he's done a lot of work of studying Buddhism and Taoism, and just listening to those guys talk, and they are such good storytellers. Like, if you're really listening and really like engrossed in what they're doing, you will experience shifts in your awareness, in your conscious, as you're listening to them. And when you have that experience, that's where, for me, I'm just like, okay, pay attention, listen to this a lot, and take what you can. Like, there's obviously a point where you need to put the books down, put the podcast on pause, and actually practice it in your life. That's a huge step. Is that something you have to communicate with your students at the Karma Teachers?
Yeah, for sure. But here's the thing that I think of with Eckhart Tolle and Ram Dass and Alan Watts, all these people, and maybe you have this experience too, but do you ever find that when you're listening to their lectures or when you're reading their books, it all seems so simply explicated and explained? But then when you go to your partner or you go to your friend or that person on the street and you try and explain that same philosophy, you're just stumbling over your words. But it's because it's a simple truth. But then you step out and you just forget it. But it's the remembering. So these are people that have managed to remember really well.
I think I remember. I think I remember at times. I slip in and out of that, like probably most people do.
Absolutely. Unless you're enlightened.
Yeah. And Mike touched on this earlier, but lately I've been watching YouTube videos of this guy named. Why am I keep drawing blanks on names today?
What's he look like?
Mooji. Have you guys heard of Mooji? Mooji. And he's Jamaican, but he looks like an Indian guru, and he was apparently enlightened by some famous Indian guru. I'm not sure which one, but I've been watching, and he says all the same messages, all the same stuff we're talking about, or all these other teachers talk about. He says the same things, but he's this black man who sits on a stage and like he's got like 100 people in front of him and does satsang and he just answers questions for them. Yeah. And I watch those videos a lot, and then I think to myself, okay, how much longer do I have to watch these videos for? Why, like you said, turn off the YouTube, stop reading the book and become present right here now in your condo and just sit here and be present. And that's actually the work. Right. It does become almost a sort of, it's a good source of entertainment, but it is still entertaining. It's like, oh yes, tell me how to be enlightened, as opposed to just sitting and being present, because that's the work. Like you said, when you hear these people speak, and then you go onto the street, and it's so easy to feel like somebody's wronged you. They didn't hold the door for you. Mm-hmm. They talked to you the wrong way. They cut you off in traffic, whatever it happened to be, and then we slip out of it.
Well, when we become servants to the process, like, well, I need to sit and I need to listen to the rest of this podcast, or I need to go to the studio and I need to do my vinyasa practice, or I need to go and sit down and do the meditation. When all of that gets in the way of you actually living your life, they say that's a golden chain. So a golden chain is something that's incredibly opulent and auspicious and beautiful and valuable, but a chain is a chain, and at the end of the day, you're still in bondage. So I think you're onto something. It's like, why am I just sitting here? Why am I not present?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when you talk about presence, if you were going to try to describe that to somebody, how would you describe that?
Oh, I'm sure there's some great story of a monk just yelling at somebody or something that I could think of to be present. Yeah. Well, but okay, here's a good monk story that I have that I'm pretty sure I must have got from Ram Dass anyways. So if you go and listen to those podcasts, you'll hear it from the horse's mouth. But the story is this. There was two monks sitting there, and one monk was more senior to the other. And the junior monk says, Master, how long until I become enlightened? And he says, 7 years. And he goes, 7 years? What if I come in twice as much? What if I do twice as much scripture? What if I meditate for twice as much? And he looks at him and goes, 14 years. So the idea is like we can't, with these processes, we have to be patient. And so to be present, it can't be about getting to a place. So we talk about mindfulness and like what kind of work do I have to do? What kind of work do I have to do to be mindful? It's like, well, it's just really simple. You peel back those layers and you can remember your perfection or your connection to the universe or to God or whatever the word is that you use. But that's being present.
Yeah. Like if I were, you want to go ahead?
I was just going to ask you, and if you want to do your question first, if it's more related, I was going to ask you about your meditation practice.
No, go.
Okay, so can you describe what you try to do as your meditation practice versus, like, do you do like a seated practice?
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So one of the things I love about doing the teacher trainings is we start every morning off with half an hour meditation. So what I love about that is I just have to show up at the studio where I'm teaching the teacher training, and then I get to sit with everybody. Now, when I'm not teaching the teacher trainings, it becomes a little bit harder. And do I sit half an hour every morning when I do a meditation practice? No, my meditation practice is actually much shorter at home than it is when I'm with my students. And from time to time, I drop it because I do want to be mindful again of that golden chain, right? So I had, and probably when I first met you, I was at the studio that we were talking about earlier. I was there every day for 2 or 3 classes. And it goes down to that conversation about losing my identity as an athlete, so I needed to become a yogi. So that 8 hours that I was going to spend in the gym, I started spending that 8 hours at the yoga studio, right? So it's just like, and then eventually the yoga practice had a way of kind of calming me down in such a way where that turned down to 1 class a day. And after about 740 days, I actually tried spending a day not at the studio. But I went through one point, and I tell this story in teacher training, and it comes off, I think as more time passes, it becomes more of a sadder story than I thought it was. But the story is probably about 5 years ago when I about, let's say 5 years. But when I was really, really, really passionately doing my yoga practice, and like that junior monk, I'm like, well, I can get to enlightenment by doing 3 power classes a day, right?
So funny, yeah.
Yeah, so I remember it was nearing Christmas time, and I was obsessively going to the studio, and my mom said, Kent, for Christmas, just don't go to yoga. And I said, okay, and I promised her that I wasn't going to go to yoga. And it sounds like a sadder story than it is, but I think it's a good story for teacher trainings. Because what I ended up doing is I woke up, and before everyone woke up for Christmas morning, I snuck out of the house. As a teenager, I never snuck out of the house to go party or did anything that would upset my parents. But this is probably at 25 years old. I snuck out of my parents' house on Christmas morning to go practice a yoga Pilates class, because that's what I felt that I needed to do to be, again, falling victim to a label of a yogi. What I realize now with hindsight and hopefully a little bit more wisdom behind me is that the yoga was at home on Christmas morning. The yoga was to be with my family. The yoga wasn't to go, to the studio.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want that to sound like a cop-out, but that's my way of saying I don't have a steady meditation practice.
Yeah, no, I think that's a healthy approach, because I think it is a good thing to be able to sit down for 10, 15, 20 minutes and be able to sit there and to breathe and to train the mind to be able to do that relatively comfortably. I think there's pros to that for sure. I think health-wise, I think mental health-wise, and also just maybe recognizing and self-learning, introspection-wise, However, I think that's a really good point and a good reminder for me too, is that, watch out for those golden chains, because you can easily get tied to it, and, that's something we could look at floating as well, like, oh, I have to float. You don't have to. You don't have to do anything.
Yeah, not if it's irritating your eye like it is.
Yeah. Totally. No, folks, the float tank did not cause this sty, on the record.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kent.
Method, right? Somebody was talking about that, and like eventually you have to drop the method. So once you've obtained whatever teaching it is from that method, drop the method completely, get rid of it. And actually, that was Osho. Osho was talking about method. Osho's a really interesting one as well.
Absolutely.
I really liked first of all, his lectures are extremely entertaining. Yeah. They're really cool, and he's funny and has a lot of interesting things to say. But interesting story though. It's like, this kind of shifts gears. Like that Muji character is kind of like a modern day, not nearly as big as Osho was, but a lot of people, if you don't talk about method, they get lost in following a guru. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty common one. You see people like these people that surrounded Osho in his life, they became like these crazy devotees, and they just never left him.
Right.
And they were free to leave, but they didn't. And it's like, again, like you going to yoga every single day for 740 days. That's what you said, right?
Yeah.
It's like that addiction, that obsession, and it's like, can you drop that? And I always find it interesting when people turn that obsession onto a person. Mm-hmm. And I think we even see that probably to a smaller degree with certain yoga teachers in this city.
Yeah. Well, we see it. And
that's not a knock on the yoga teacher or the yogi. It's just something that to be aware of. Like, are you following somebody around? Like, they have the answer now.
Well, it's when we lose that track of the fact that we're all one, right? Because you put somebody up on a pedestal, or you'll say that you should be put up on a pedestal, or even just allowing yourself to be up on the pedestal. It's super attractive to go up there. But like, I've seen it. I was an Anusara yogi, and the guy that was the head of Anusara, he had what they call a fall from grace, right? So he got up to some things that people thought, oh no, this guy's actually human and he's not divine. Where he was never saying like, I'm enlightened. He was just always a guy that could teach really good alignment for yoga postures. But there was like but anyways, the falling from grace was just this idea of he really let people down, but he didn't let them down. He let himself down. Right.
I don't know exactly who you're referring to. Maybe you don't have to say his name if you don't want to. But can you just tell me a little bit about what happened there?
I mean, it's out there. His name is John Friend. If you look up on Usara, it'll be.
And I heard about this through the yoga grapevine a few years ago.
But it happens all the time. So it happens like right now. There's the big issue going on with Bikram, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Bikram's yoga, and I'm not a Bikram yogi, so I can't really speak too specifically to it. And probably through some sort of consciousness, I've decided not to really look at what the story is, but I know a little bit about the allegations. Within Anusara, the allegations weren't quite as extreme, but still people were getting hurt, and there was attachments, and through the attachments there was suffering, and people just... It's an awkwardness that happens when we start to elevate people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? Because inevitably that elevation is attachment, the attachment to suffering. Like that's a truth that's unavoidable.
And the truth is, we go back to that whole what's right and wrong, I don't know. I mean, I don't know exactly what that guy did. I have a bit of an idea now that I recall, but I don't know details. I never actually looked into the story. But was he doing something blatantly like mean, or did people's feelings get hurt because of an action that like he was doing?
I think there were a few different accusations, and again, like I didn't get too close into it. And here's where I was in as far as Anusara when this happened. I was taking an Anusara teacher training, and they used to split the Anusara teacher trainings that would be 200 hours total. They would split them into 100-hour sections. So the first 100 hours, it would be an immersion. The second 100 hours would be a teacher training. it all kind of imploded. Anusara as a yoga lineage imploded right after I finished the 100-hour immersion. So the immersion it was more practice heavy. Like you would do 2 yoga practices a day. You would really literally immerse yourself in the practice of yoga. And then the second 100 hours was more about the philosophy of teaching. These are the principles that we get across to our students in a yoga class. In the middle of the training, my teacher, who was somewhat a senior teacher in Anusara, he dropped his status as an Anusara certified teacher. So my certification was never actually an Anusara certification at all. Like the training itself, it ended up being Kenny Graham was my teacher, and it ended up being like a 200-hour Kenny Graham teacher training.
And I mean, if it's out there, it's out there. But I heard basically he was sleeping around with a bunch of students or something.
I think it was something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't, I mean, who's to say what is and what was, but it wasn't like a violent or aggressive thing. It was just not appropriate things.
Right, so it might have been
sure there's
like
different sides to
undue
it all.
influence over students or something.
And that
like
was only part of it. I can't recall specifically, but it was to do with withholding. And I just don't want to speak out of.
Yeah.
If I knew,
but there's something along those lines.
If I knew, I would say. But there were other accusations. It was really dramatic. Somebody made a website that was like Anusara Exposed or John Exposed, something like that, and it was an anonymous website.
Smear job too on the guy. I mean, like maybe he deserved it, maybe, but that's like.
Well, who knows?
Wow.
I think the story is whoever made that, and I don't. Everybody I'm sure could have a. Like put your name here exposed, and then all they would have to do is show your search history for your Google, and that would probably be horrible enough.
Yeah, this sty is going to be on mine tomorrow. Front and center of that page.
Mike Sty Exposed.
Yeah,
no, I remember it was a certain studio director at a certain yoga studio on the North Shore, and the words were, "I'll never take another John class again."
Yeah,
and it was coming from a female too, which maybe not to say that it was right or wrong, but it was like, she probably had a very strong reaction to what he was doing, because she's a female.
Well, I'll say the only time I ever studied in person with him was after. And for the people that had seen him before and after, they were saying there were some pretty stark changes physically and energetically in the man when he sort of resurfaced. But I learned a lot from his alignment. Like his principles of alignment. It's unfortunate in a lot of ways because the metaphor of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, it was like, well, I don't want to be associated with that guy, so I'm going to start teaching yoga completely differently. But his method was good. There were some, as far as alignment, there were some good things that I still use in my teaching.
Would it go as far as if somebody was an Anusara trained teacher, that they might not get hired at certain studios?
No, I don't think so. I think it was pretty clear that wouldn't really necessarily reflect upon you as a teacher, especially in Vancouver, because Vancouver was such a hotbed for Anusara a few years ago. It was one of the really happening yoga styles that so many of the popular teachers around town were. But people, you understand that to go and take one of those teacher trainings, it would be a couple $1,000s, and you would be paying, and you would be really treated like a student. Like you would not be part of the organization or whatever. You would be so far removed from the head of the organization.
Right. When you say Anusara, it's true. When you say Anusara, just what kind of style of yoga would that be? Because I'm sure I've had teachers that have done it. So
you definitely did.
So is it like how would you describe that style of practice?
Well, it was described as like a heart-based alignment yoga.
And what does that mean?
Well, there was lots of alignment. So if you go to a yoga class and they're saying like put your arms up and bend your knees, and that they say the name of the pose, that might not necessarily be so much alignment based, but if they're giving you a bunch of cues of how to really place that pose quite
Very specific.
intricately and refined in your body, then it would be a more alignment based.
Yeah, like and some teachers will be like, they'll just tell you the pose more or less and demonstrate it a little bit. But there's some that will cue like, internally rotate your right foot slightly and, scoop your right buttocks under and whatever they would say.
And there's
right?
a few styles that would use that type of alignment, but chances are that it could have been coming from Anusara. Now, the head of Anusara for many years was an Iyengar teacher. So from BKS Iyengar, Mr. Iyengar, one of the great teachers of yoga, who never referred to himself as a teacher. He was always a learner of yoga, which even after like 8 decades of teaching yoga, to not refer to yourself as a teacher really makes me question myself when I start to think that I'm a teacher of yoga.
Yeah.
But so there's different styles that might be alignment based, but Anusara was a very popular one. And then with John, with the head of Anusara, who I don't know personally, as I call him John, right? But I've met him very briefly. He no longer aligned, or so the story goes, he no longer aligned with the classical teachings of yoga. And he started to bring a lot of tantric philosophy into his teachings of yoga. So that's why it's heart-based. So just a very simplistic look at the difference between more classical lens of yoga and a tantric-based approach to yoga would be, with the tantric yoga, it would be like, this is divine. Being in the body, experiencing these postures, it's non-dualist. So this is God. Like, this is being in this posture, this is experience God. Whereas in a classical lens of yoga, you would sit in meditation in hopes of transcending this body almost as a cage that's keeping you from connecting to something greater than yourself.
Right.
Whereas the tantrics believe that you could experience that in this body. We didn't have to leave it.
Right. Cool. In terms of lineages, so it sounded like you were getting into some lineage talk there. So it went from John to Iyengar, right? Mm-hmm. And then Iyengar. So if you could trace it all back, all the different lineages back, what would be like? What would be the origin?
God.
Okay. Of a person you can name.
So one of the godfather of Western yoga, as we sort of acknowledge it here in the West, would be Krishnamacharya. Okay, I would say, for many lineages. Now, like Kundalini is something different. Yin yoga is something different. Their philosophies come from a different place. But with Krishnamacharya, he had a lot of very prominent students come directly from him. So Iyengar was one of his students, Pattabhi Jois, and Pattabhi Jois is sort of, in a lot of ways, the founder or the person that moved forward the Ashtanga sequence. So the practice of Ashtanga. Indra Devi is a very prominent female yoga teacher. One of the great things that Krishnamacharya did is he actually started to teach women in his later in life. So teaching Indra Devi was actually like a huge progressive step forward for the teaching of yoga, which had generally been taught just to adolescent males. Deshakachar, Krishnamacharya's son, is also a very prominent yoga teacher. All of those people have passed now. Deshakachar, who is a little bit younger than most of those other teachers, just passed away recently in the last few months, and Iyengar passed away a few years ago.
Krishnamacharya. So where did he learn from?
I've heard different stories. Do you know?
I heard that he went into the Himalayas for a while and then came back
from Shiva in a cave.
I didn't hear that exact story. Is that what it is, or? Well,
I think I've heard that story. I think that you can choose to take that literally or figuratively, just like this idea of I went up into the Himalayas and Shiva, like an embodiment of God, taught me. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be a blue man in a cave taught me story, although being like a Star Wars comic book guy, then it could actually be a Yoda type character, like a, Shiva in a cave. But that's what I've heard. There's also stories about Krishnamacharya just wanting to be a renunciate, like just wanting to live the rest of his life up in a cave. But the teacher that taught him yoga in the old schools of India, apparently as a teacher, you could ask whatever you wanted from your students as payment for the teaching. So he requested that for payment, Krishnamacharya, since he was such a gifted teacher, would actually go back and become a householder, live in the city, open up a school, teach many people, and seemed to be a good investment because by and large, the reason that we do yoga today is because he did decide to come down from the hills and
so the teacher's payment that he learned from requested that he goes to the city to teach more people.
Yeah, because all that Krishnamacharya wanted out of life was to stay in a cave, apparently. Like to just get to be a yogi in a cave was to him the highest, which seems very sort of antithetical to what we want out of our lives when we get caught in the momentum, like we talked about earlier, of consumerism and, well, I want the biggest mansion, right? You wouldn't want to go live in a cave. You wouldn't want to live in an austere way. You'd want to live with affluence.
Oh, right. Yeah, normal.
Right?
Yes,
like
yes.
just normal, like the momentum.
Normal narrative.
Yeah, and what we would deem to be a successful life. But for a holy man, for a renunciate, it's like, I just want to live in a cave. I want to meditate. And then the meditation from the cave, perhaps that will lift or raise kind of the vibration of everybody. Like the yogis out in the cave or out in the wilderness are said to be helping everybody. So to ask him to go and have children, to ask him to go and have a wife and to raise students, that was like a horrible and huge ask, but he did it. And because he did it, the teachings of yoga continue to flow through all of the world,
It's a good story, for sure. It's a very interesting story. It's like, that's how it came to be. So it does tie nicely into the Shiva theory, right?
Tell me about it.
No, I mean, it's just the sense
just
the sense that Shiva, if he is the embodiment of God, telling him that I'll teach you this amazing skill, and now you have to go pay it back
because
to
it worked out.
Yeah.
Because it did sort of, the waves did ripple so far that it did look like, well, this person that asked him to do that really did know what he was choosing to ask, because 120 years later or whatever it would be, you've got Kent Brun practicing yoga in Vancouver for some reason.
There you go.
Right?
Sorry, how are we doing for time?
We're at almost an hour 30.
Oh, wow.
So,
holy cow, that's
I know.
a great conversation.
I know, time flies.
Just shift gears before we wrap it up a little bit. How widespread is the popularity of yoga now? Do you think it's still growing, or has it kind of stagnated? Or what do you think, just from what you can see, what's happening with it?
A few years ago, it seemed like CrossFit became the new yoga. Did you notice that in this, like all of the cliques of people that would come and do the yoga practice went to CrossFit all of a sudden?
Yes.
And I think that to me makes sense, because when people try and put yoga into this idea or this very small box of being a workout, it's really limiting to what the practice of yoga's potential is. And it's such an ineffective way to actually work out your body. Because you both have, and myself, we've all seen what happens when you get an actual regiment and you go to the gym and you lift weights in a periodized schedule. Like, it's much more effective to getting your body into physical shape. Mm-hmm. So I think that yoga being sold as a fad, I don't know what the actual like uptake is for new students. It seems to me like it's not so much, but there's yoga studios all over the place. So I don't know.
There are, but they're not maybe growing as quickly as they were maybe at the turn of the millennia. Yeah. And also the new ones that do come on board aren't usually packed to the brim either. You know what I mean? So it does seem to be kind
leveling out a little
leveling
bit.
out, slowing down.
Like there was an explosion phase, and I would say I moved to Vancouver just when it was exploding, probably around 2008. And it was just like, whoa, yoga, and then everyone started doing yoga from like 2008, 2012. It was like super popular.
And I feel like it was missold and misrepresented for what it actually was. And just this idea of you'll get into great shape, you'll lose all this weight in hot yoga, whatever it is. It's just you
But that's
as well as
possible.
It's possible, but it's not the most efficient way to do it.
Yeah. You know what, though? I would argue that it is a pretty good way to do it because you're lessening your chances of injuries by doing it, too. Because it's like you're going to get that good calorie burn, you know, but if you're going to a CrossFit gym, you're way more likely to get hurt.
Oh, yeah. And I think, you know, I've misspoken if you think that I'm a fan of CrossFit. But
Well, you can't tell by looking at you because you're pretty jacked over
no. I think lifting weights in a reasonable way is good for people.
Yeah.
I think to make lifting weights into a competition is inherently dangerous.
Yeah, it's interesting. They made CrossFit actually the exercise itself into a sport.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah. So,
Yeah. It's an interesting phenomenon.
But it's, you know,
But
the
they
same
did
thing
Bikram
kinda
yogas
happened.
kind of do that. There's like
All
yoga
yoga
competitions and stuff.
Yeah.
Yoga competitions.
yeah.
And just like in class.
You'll
like,
hear about yoga champions every once in a while.
Yeah, the yoga champion. I want to be a yoga champion. But just like, you know, even in class, people like who are really advanced or really talented or doing handstands or press handstands, and it's always like, oh, I want to do that. Like, it's like human nature almost to compare and try to aspire to be something. You know?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, my personal practice with it's been more so from just a balancing act of weight training and then mobility, and then I do appreciate the strength. The strength element of yoga as well. It's not all just flexibility for people that don't really practice it. There's tremendous strength involved in core strength and integrated strength and postural strength. I think posture is huge for our inner organ cells. So I've used it in a sense of just a good complement because what are my goals in the gym? I'm not trying to bench press 225 for a max number of repetitions anymore. It's for me, it's been a very good balancing act, and I'll go back to it. I still use yoga for a physical health side, but then I do also enjoy the energetic of it. You know, for me, it's about energetic awareness, and by the end of that, you kind of go into this trance-like kind of mindful state when you're practicing. But at the end of that final shavasana, you can have some really unique consciousness experiences, which is what I personally enjoy. You know, I enjoy having an experience where it feels like you're dissolving away, and it sounds bizarre, but you know, it's true.
Yeah.
For me.
Yeah.
No, that's beautiful.
Well, that was awesome, man.
Yeah. Thank
Like,
you for.
I feel like I could keep going. Like I feel like I could do another hour and a half, no problem.
Well, it's
I can
dinner
keep going.
time,
You
though,
guys
dude.
just-
Is this a challenge?
No,
I know.
I keep going. The one thing that I would like to touch on just before we leave is when we talk about these practices, we need to also have the conversation always about appropriation, like cultural appropriation. And when we teach or when we hold space or when we use these tools, it's important to acknowledge where these practices are coming from, and that we don't want to belittle them on purpose or accidentally or make somebody feel as though they no longer have ownership over their practices, right? I do think that yoga is for everyone, but at the same time, it's when we do market yoga, I think here in the West, we have to be careful about how we do market it. And are we limiting the potential of this great practice?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair thing to say at the very least, because it is important to acknowledge where practices come from, what were their original usage and intentions. Although that can evolve as a culture evolves, as you know, cultural appropriation is a very interesting topic, and you know, I look at it as cultures have been exchanging practices, exchanging items, exchanging foods, ideas, languages, hybridizations, people forever. That's what cultures kind of do, is they do share things, you know, and I think when someone is saying, oh, I'm from a certain culture and you can't do this is the very extreme form of culture appropriation kind of activism out there, I guess. I mean, I never really understood it. You know, it didn't really sit super well with me. Like, for example, I like to play the didgeridoo.
Yeah.
But I'm not native Aboriginal to Australia. I'm a white guy in Canada with an Eastern European background. Yeah. So am I not allowed to play the didgeridoo? Is that wrong for me to play the didgeridoo? Am I abusing? I think it's intention is number one. And intention is number one. You know, like, what is my intention behind it? So I think that's a very fair point. And
intention's valuable. It's also just being open and recognizing how people are viewing your intention as well. So if my intention is not to hurt, but I am hurting a bunch of people, then I might just easily change what I'm doing to be more sensitive. I think it's different. The conversation that we're having is not that I want to be Kim Kardashian and wear a traditional First Nations headdress.
Right. Totally.
Because yoga is a practice of oneness. Right. So it's an interesting conversation with cultural appropriation, because if it's a practice of oneness and if it's to create mindfulness and if it's to spread health and well-being, then I think that there's a value in sharing it to all people.
I would agree with that one. And I'd also ask why somebody's getting so hurt by somebody else using a part of their culture. Why does that bother you so much? Anybody, that so much? You know what I mean? It's like, I get that that's a meaningful thing to you, whatever it happens to be. But it's like, I don't know. I feel like it's just another form of attachment, and it's just like, oh, you can't do this because I do this, and it's mine, and it's ownership, and it's like, this is ours, and you know, and even if they are doing it to make money or whatever it happens to be, well, why do you care? I mean, why does it take away from the fact that you do it because they do it?
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. That's why I don't see the point, the problem there.
There's a lot of angles, I think a lot of layers to it, and a lot of lenses you can look at it through too. So, you know, maybe it's not.
It doesn't take away. If somebody in India is doing yoga and they get a lot out of it, if somebody in North America is doing yoga and selling it, why does that take away from what you're getting out of yoga?
Yeah, I just think that it's in this place of privilege that we find ourselves as three white males in Vancouver right now. It's important that we're open to at least hearing, well, if people are being offended, why are they being offended? Because it's easy to say that what I'm doing is not offensive, but if people are finding or taking offense to it, then how can we keep these lines of dialogue open in such a way where we can come with an understanding of, hey, I like to stretch and breathe. And the story of Ganesh really resonates with me. So how can I be a student of all of these philosophies while at the same time not stepping on any toes or belittling someone?
This is a really good podcast. I'm going to turn everybody to listen to at this point.
Kent Brun Podcast, professionals talking yoga.
Jordan Peterson on Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
Okay. He talked about this in depth.
He's the U of T professor, right? That you talked about.
And he's very like, doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter. He's like, you know, he's like, if someone's being offended by something that you do, that's their problem, not yours, more or less. Like, it's just like he breaks it down way better than that, obviously. Like, but and when he breaks it down, like he talks about how, you know, if we're trying to shelter everybody from every single thing that, like, I could get offended by a million things in my life, right? And if you're trying to shelter and protect everybody from not being offended, you're disempowering them, because it's like, if they're being offended, you know, that's something for them to look at. Like, again, why does that bother them? You know what I mean? It's like, it's really, he used the example of, like, and this is going to be a little bit off topic, but if somebody had major social anxiety,
right?
Like, you don't try to isolate them and say, okay, we're not going to put you in social situations anymore, okay, because that's causing you some pain. He says what you do is you build up their resistance to that social anxiety in a sense. So it's like you're strengthening them gradually. So the first step might be someone has extreme social anxiety. You go to a party. Your goal is to talk to 2 people, and then you can leave. Right. And then you eventually increase that, and you eventually will more or less. And he has a whole formula, and he is a psychology professor, and he has a whole program on how to strengthen people as opposed to try to protect and shelter every little thing that might offend people. And he says by doing that, you're actually disempowering them.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a beautiful, like, to indoctrinate people slowly back into society, people that are isolating themselves. I think that still you just want to be sensitive that if your actions are violent towards somebody, or if they're isolating for somebody, and if all it requires is that you just change your actions a little bit so that there's less pain and suffering in the world, then that would be different than reintegrating somebody into society.
Yeah, and I think that should be that philosophy should be approached to everything and anything and everything in life. Like, it's just like, let's just be human. Let's just be caring and as conscious as possible of our actions across the board on everything, on how we open the door, how we acknowledge people, how we shake people's hands, beyond
what if someone cuts you off in traffic and you get pissed off?
Well, I mean,
it's the same thing,
right? So exactly. So I mean, let's just be as appropriate in all areas of life versus like in this one cultural bubble. I think let's take it out of like these little spheres of organization and just apply being a good person to everything, and a respectful person, and a conscious person, and aware. So why segregate it?
You chase forever. That could be a rabbit hole you chase forever, man.
Well, I think
he talks about how, like, the extreme left, and he talks about this like, and it's the whole like the gender pronoun thing. How there's like 72 different gender pronouns, and that you could potentially lose your job if you say or use the wrong one or refuse to use them. And he talks about how this way of thinking actually leads to complete censorship, complete silence, and actually leads to this is like what brought about communism and communism regimes and totalitarianism and everything. He says because the far left, if you go down far enough, ends up in genocide.
I think if you keep it on this intellectual plane, you're right. I think you're right. If it's always on this intellectual plane, I think it has to transcend that. I think it has to go to a realm that's beyond whatever that is. And I don't really have an answer to this. I'm not pretending like I do, but I think it has to transcend intellectuality, political correctness, like that sort of level of it to I don't know.
For my students in the teacher training, one of the important aspects of being a teacher, it's summed up in the Bhagavad Gita. Again, to go back to it, we can tie up this whole conversation with the Bhagavad Gita.
Beautiful.
But it's said that it's bad karma to try and teach people lessons that they don't want to listen to or are unable to hear. So if that guy cuts you off in traffic and then you track him down and you follow him to his house and you're going to teach him the lesson, that's your karma. Like, you're creating fluctuations in the universe that are violent and aggressive. So if somebody is saying that they want to identify as a unicorn or as a worm, and they're offended if you're saying Mr. or Mrs., you don't have to then fire back and say, like, well, you're a man, so be a Mr. You can just as easily say, no problem. Next time that I talk to you, I'll identify you as X or worm or whatever it is that you're wanting to identify as. And I don't think that we have to stand up and have to teach everybody, this is my worldview and that's right, because that's dogma. And there's been so much violence that's been caused because of that dogma.
That's true.
Yeah.
And I am for not hurting people's feelings.
For the record.
Beautiful way to finish it.
Yeah. Cool.
Andy learned a lesson.
There we go.
Folks, if you enjoyed hearing Kent on our podcast, definitely go and check out his podcast, the Kent Brun Podcast, on iTunes and SoundCloud. And you have an Instagram account. So follow him on Instagram, Kent.Brun.
Yeah, Kent.Brun.
B-R-U-N.
Because we're Anglos with a French name.
Okay.
But yeah, for the prettiest pictures on Instagram, follow me.
Oh yeah,
There you
they
go.
They are pretty. You are a handsome man.
Thank you. Thank you.
The Whispering Grizzly.
Yeah.
WG. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's
Appreciate
been a beautiful experience.
Cool.
Awesome.
Anything else to throw out to the community? If you're still with us, man,
Come to
kudos
the
to
meetups.
you. Thank you.
Meet up with come up to the meetups and get connected to the community, and we all do sorts of stuff, and it's all free, which is crazy.
Always
we do all
all
these things
free.
for free. So,
And if you did enjoy this podcast, give it a like or a share. Help us out. Spread the word. And if you stayed this long, you're
You're a champion.
You're a champion, and maybe share it.
yeah, share the conversation,
Until next time,
and tag us to whatever is.
to whatever is.